Welcome back to Joy, even on your worst day. I'm glad you're here. Several years after I was married, my wife and we bought our first house. I wasn't very skilled at buying a home. I'd never done it before. I didn't quite know the things that you should look for. So it was only after we moved in that we realized the degree of fixer-upper that we had purchased. Some of the kitchen cabinets didn't close right. The spare bedroom turned out needed a paint job. There were no towel racks in any of the bathrooms and some rotten spots in the deck. I looked at her and said, "Well, it's home, but we got some work to do." That's kind of how Paul understands salvation. He has just walked through the humbling choice of Christ to come and dwell with us and to bring salvation. It's a hymn that they actually sang together, we believe. But then Paul, he says this: "Work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who is at work in you, enabling you both to will and to work for God's good pleasure." Work out your salvation. What does he mean by that? Well, he certainly doesn't mean work to earn your salvation. Paul would have none of that. Salvation is God's work. It's not only not something that we need to do, it is not something we can possibly do. Salvation is God's work. So in our faith tradition, we practice the sacrament of baptism with infants. Parents, they bring their children to us in a time of worship. They're weeks old, months old, little ones, and we baptize them. And in that moment, we don't know much about these little ones. We don't know if they're going to grow up to love geometry or to be good at art. We don't know if they're going to grow up to love to sing or to play soccer. We don't know if they're going to grow up to be an attorney or just grow up to need one. We don't know much about them, actually, not early on like that. But there's one thing that we do know. There's one thing that we trust. We trust that they are God's children. That's what we say in baptism. These are children of God, and we are confident of this not because we know anything about what's in the hearts of these children, but because we know what lives in the heart of God. It is a love that calls us by name and will never let us go. That is our salvation. So when Paul says, work out your salvation, he's not saying you need to earn it. He's saying you don't need to become God's children. Live the truth that you are God's children. That is what it is to work out your salvation. It's a little bit like this. In the novel A Prayer for Owen Meany, the opening sentence reads this way: "I am doomed to remember a boy with a wrecked voice, not because of the voice, or even because he is the smallest person I have ever known, or even because he was the instrument of my own mother's death, but because he is the reason I believe in God. I am a Christian because of Owen Meany." I am doomed to remember a boy with a wrecked voice. I don't know what that voice sounds like. If you've ever read the novel, you know that John Irving wrote all of Owen Meany's speech in all caps. It's a visual way to say that this voice doesn't fit in easily. It's not acclimated easily to the culture. And most people found his voice grating, a little repulsive even. But Owen's best friend, Johnny Wheelwright, he says this: "In my life, I have apprenticed myself to his voice. His cartoon voice has made an even stronger impression on me than my grandmother's imperious wisdom. I have apprenticed myself to his voice." I think in a way that's a way to think about what Paul is saying here. To work out our salvation is to apprentice our life, to apprentice our choices and our way, to the mind of Christ, the way of Christ, the life of Christ, the voice of Christ. Working out our salvation is apprenticing ourselves to the one who has come in a humble choice to bring salvation to the whole world. And Paul says, work out your salvation in fear and trembling. He doesn't mean be afraid because it might not work. He doesn't mean be afraid because there is something against you, that God is holding something against you. It's not that at all. The fear and trembling is the posture because it's important. We know it's important. It's maybe the same kind of fear and trembling that we have when you ask or you hear, will you marry me? Or when you hear, you can start on Monday. Or when you hear, it's a girl. It's not a fear of failure. It's the fear, the awe, the trembling, because this is important. This matters. That's what Paul says. Work out your salvation in every day of your life because it matters. One more thing about this. Salvation, working out your salvation, is not a solo act. It's not something I do just in me and for me and by me. When Paul says work out your salvation, it's you plural. When he says God is at work in you, it is you plural. This is something the community of faith does together. We work out our salvation with one another, in relationship with one another. And as we've been saying throughout this study, that working out of our salvation, it shows up in our choices, in the choices we make with one another, the choice to have the mind of Christ with one another. It reminds me of the novel The Secret Life of Bees, that tells of a 14-year-old runaway named Lily. She is a precocious and delightful child. She finds herself taken in by some African-American sisters, all named after the warmer months of the year. August is the matriarch, and May is the one most in need. And one time, Lily and August were having a conversation, and Lily asked, as a 14-year-old would, if your favorite color is blue, how come your house is painted pink? August smiled. She said, well, May was with me the day I went to the paint store. I had a nice tan color in mind, but May latched onto this color called Caribbean pink. She said it made her feel so good, made her want to dance a Spanish flamenco. And I thought, well, it's the tackiest color I've ever seen. But if it makes May feel that good, I guess she deserves to live inside of it. She said, you know, Lily, some things in life don't matter that much, like the color of a house. In the big scheme of things, how important is the color of a house? But lifting someone's heart, now that matters. She says, you know, the whole trouble with people is, Lily interrupts, they don't know what matters and what doesn't. August said, I was going to say, they know what matters. They just seldom choose it. I love May, she said, but it was still hard to choose Caribbean pink. The hardest thing on earth is choosing what matters. We began by saying that the Christ hymn, the mind of Christ that is revealed in the one who humbles himself that he might live with us, that is to shape our choices all the time. And that's hard. It's the hardest thing in the earth. No wonder Paul calls it work. He says, work out your salvation in fear and trembling, but do so knowing this, that God is at work in you. You remember from the very first paragraph of the letter, he says, the good work that God has begun in you, he will bring to completion. And all between that beginning and completion, God is at work in you. So trust this. The love of God is a holy love that has called you by name. And it is a love that will never let you go. It is a love that is at work in you even now, to will and to work for God's own good pleasure. Trust that that love claims you. And then do the best you know how to live every day defined by that same holy love. That is working out your salvation.